Students, Mr. Williams here, taking you through another subsection from Section 13, Reagan and the American Resurgence. We're talking about Ron's actions and efforts to end the Cold War. So when it comes to foreign policy, what efforts were being taken by Reagan and his administration to keep America ahead of the curve and protecting her interest abroad, and spreading goodwill and protecting others from tyranny, so on and so forth. Okay, as with every president, this is a lofty goal, and unfortunately, there were some mistakes that were made. There were some civilian, innocent lives that were lost abroad. Not everything is always coming up roses. This video or this content would also have been covered to an extent in the Reagan Revolution CNN video Q&A that you needed to watch, okay? So I'm going to kind of go through this relatively quickly. Reagan, described by many as a Cold War warrior. He doesn't have a veteran-like background similar to JFK, similar to Nixon, similar to Carter, similar to Ford, okay? He didn't have that actual, physical, I did fight tyranny as an American military serviceman type of background, okay? But he does champion the classic American ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not infringing upon the unalienable rights that God vested to man. So with that in mind, he does see the Cold War as good versus evil. He sees it very similar to JFK in that regard and approaches it as such. Heck, being as I want to say reckless to refer to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, piggybacking off of some of the Star Wars hysteria of the late 70s, early 80s. At the 41st Annual Convention for the National Association of Evangelicals, he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. So a rekindling, if you will, a firing up of the Cold War between the US of A and the Soviet Union, those two de facto superpowers, takes place early on during Reagan's first term. He's going to rebuild the United States military where there was demilitarization by previous presidents in an effort at diplomacy. Reagan thinks, like Teddy Roosevelt, we're going to speak softly but carry a big stick. With technological advancements that were entering into the daily lives of Americans, there were also significant technological advancements in the world of warfare. And Reagan drops a lot of money into that, or gets the United States Congress and through other avenues funding to drop into a lot of that. He proposes the Strategic Defense Initiative, which many critics of Reagan labeled as Star Wars, because it was going to use land-based and satellite-based lasers or weapons of some kind to disable threatening missiles from adversaries. Again, cutting edge, maybe ahead of his time. Heck, we just launched our Space Force here in the US of A. But Reagan was big into using defense contracts to fire up certain areas of the American economy, of our industrial complex, and wanted an expanded military to not only strengthen America's resolve abroad and our feeling here at home about being safe, about being the biggest and baddest on the block, but it was also a strategy in Cold War warfare. He thought if America could spend and be public about its spending in terms of military advancement, military ability, the Soviets would have to engage in expanding and building their military, and he believed they couldn't do it. He believed the Soviet system was on the verge. His administration advised him, their intelligence said, Soviet system was on the verge of financial and economic collapse. So there was another aspect of this that Reagan wanted to engage in, and that was basically a spending war, that we can spin the Soviet Union into oblivion, into a level where they would have to close their doors, dissolve as a government. Reagan took on the approach of the opponent of my enemy as my friend, similar to FDR back in World War II. Many of his anti-USSR policies, known as collectively the Reagan Doctrine, and basically he starts to fund anti-communist operatives around the world. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan, actual American forces in Grenada, and the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Now, a lot of questionable interactions and acts involved in many of these affairs. But at the end of the day, make no bones about it, Ronald Reagan was going to financially support and even militarily support opponents of communism, even if the people he was supporting were questionable. Okay? Again, similar to us aligning ourselves with Stalin. We knew he was a megalomaniac, tyrannical, authoritative, oppressive dictator. Okay? He was exactly what we were looking to destroy with Hitler and the militarism of Tojo and Hirohito. But we aligned with him because we needed him to destroy the adversaries that were the biggest threats at that time. So Reagan takes some similar action in the 1980s throughout the decade. Not everything worked out, though, okay? One of the plot lines in Tom Clancy's Amazon Prime adaptation of Jack Ryan deals with some civilian casualties resulting in America's efforts to suppress terrorist-like operatives in the Middle East in the early 1980s. So like Muammar Gaddafi, okay, an individual that was wreaking havoc in the Middle East at this time, anti-American terrorist threats in Lebanon. America got involved in the early 1980s trying to keep the peace in the Middle East. And unfortunately, it results in American casualties, like the bombing in Beirut, with 241 Americans killed by a suicide truck while they were sleeping in their barracks, and also some situations in Libya with Gaddafi. These are still extremely complex and unfortunate situations to this day that America still tries to successfully navigate through and attempt to keep the peace as well as possible. But not everything Reagan did in terms of foreign policy was an amazing achievement. And like I said at the beginning of the video, some nasty tragedies did result. Through the 1980s, though, Soviet communism begins to collapse. And a lot of that is because they're suffering financially. There's no longer food on the table or jobs and income to be earned for individuals, and they want to speak their minds. Again, the idea of a purely socialistic, communistic society, it's utopian. It is at our core, all right, to aspire to do bigger and better things or to have certain level of free will. You can't have that. You can't have that in some of these societies, ideologically speaking. Areas in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia begin to flirt with independence. Many of those areas, that independent yearning is suppressed by military efforts by the Soviet Union, but it continues to grow, and it is proliferated when Mikhail Gorbachev takes over as the de facto leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And when he does, he's basically taking over a sinking ship. The economy cannot keep up with the United States of America, most notably because it cannot keep up with its military spending. Soviet agriculture, industry, oil production, they've all fallen on hard times. And like the US of A in the 1970s, Soviet technology and innovation, its R&D, is way backlogged, okay? Reagan's role is basically to continue to challenge the Soviet status quo, keep spending, keep sowing seeds of a revolution in some of these Soviet satellite states. And before long, all right, the Soviet Union will come toppling down. Gorbachev also sees this, and he's wanting to successfully navigate the Soviet Union into a new era. So he actually subscribes glasnost and perestroika, transparency and openness, and a certain level of political freedom, basically setting the table for a light version of communism, but ultimately getting the Soviet Union positioned to where it's not just all out infighting and civil warfare as it finally comes toppling down. Gorbachev had some foresight. He knew when he took over in 1985, this ship was going down. So he did his best to almost, in a way, attempt to steer it to where the least amount of bloodshed, hopefully, would be experienced by all individuals under the Soviet umbrella. Reagan did have one big policy failure, and it was the Iran-Contra affair. I believe that is discussed in the Reagan Revolution video. You can watch this video, Google it. Basically, he gets caught, all right? He had isolated himself somewhat, okay? He gets caught somewhat authorizing illegal payments to Iran, a current enemy of the United States of America, to get weapons to the Contra fighters, because Congress said we're no longer going to support the Contras because we don't like their ideology or what they've been doing. But Reagan wanted to continue to use them to fight the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And anyways, the channels in which he goes through to achieve it, not good, okay, illegal. Stuff blows up, but basically Reagan's got some guys that, fall on the sword per se and take the blame for him. There we go. Then we got a slide recapping that. So if you want to pause that and check that out, examine that bad boy, okay? Ultimately, though, little known fact is Rocky Balboa's role. I didn't set this up well at all. But Sly Stallone as Rocky Balboa. Believe it or not, it was Rocky that kind of started the slip slide of Soviet communism's hold on the Eastern Hemisphere. His defeat of Ivan Drago, okay, on Soviet soil, basically persuaded the Soviet public at large to start believing in liberty, free will, and American exceptionalism. This is a great little YouTube video, kind of a spoof on, I guess, some of the cinematic and television and sports-like efforts to get Americans to continue to rail against communism. Hulk Hogan even did similar spoofs in WWF. We'll watch a minute of this, but I'll let you watch it on your own. But yes, courtesy of Rocky Balboa. The ball continues to roll to defeat Soviet communism. Reagan did a certain amount, yes, but you got to give Rocky some credit too. Yes, for those of you that are not following, this is all fiction. It's good stuff. For anybody that's followed this and kept up with things.
So it's 1985, which is 3 years after Balboa Lang 2, which at the time was the most watched fight in U.S. boxing history.
From a political standpoint, it was as tense as ever.
In the sports world, U.S. and the Soviets, they really hated each other.
Memories are still fresh of the Olympic upset in 1980, and surely the Soviets wanted revenge.
In comes Ivan Drago.
Drago is the kind of embodiment of the Soviet Union. Half machine, and you wonder if he has a soul in there somewhere. And Apollo Creed is the embodiment of America.
Now, I've followed boxing and dance for 23 years. Apollo Creed was in dance shape, not boxing shape.
Creed is clearly exhausted by the dance number he did with James Brown 5 minutes earlier. And before the second round is over, that's it.
This was very difficult for the American public to see.
I've only cried twice.
All right, so that does it. I encourage you to watch that. It's a good chuckle. But if you follow that, again, spoof, okay, that piece of satire, you're also following or picking up on some of the monumental events that took place through the 1980s that lead to the fall of the Soviet Union, okay? Our last couple of subsections here will be the introduction of the 1990s, the 88 election between George Herbert Walker Bush and Michael Dukakis, and then the 1992 election that gives us old Slick Willie, William Jefferson Clinton, as president of the United States of America from 93 to 2001. All right, that's it for now. Catch you later.